So the previous two panel workshops have focused on the effects of trade agreements on climate change protection, as well as on the role that multilateral trade organizations, especially the World Trade Organization, can play or cannot play in advancing the cause of climate change, or rather fighting climate change, I should say. So today's panel returns us now to the question that is really at the heart of the mandate of the Jean Monnet Network on Transatlantic Trade Politics, and that is the motivations and impact of political contestation around the trade climate nexus. And to discuss this, we have brought together a really great group of scholars. We will hear three presentations by Kathryn Harrison, Tamara Kay, and Gabriele Spilker, then a comment by Gabriel Siles-Brügge, and finally, the floor will be open to questions and discussion. So that is the agenda. And let's then move straight to the first presentation, which, as I mentioned, is by Kathryn Harrison. Kathryn is Professor of Political Science at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. She's an expert on Canadian and international environmental, climate, and energy policy, on federalism, as well as on comparative public policy. Her most recent publications include the articles Political Institutions and Supply-Side Climate Politics, Lessons from Coal Ports in the United States and Canada, as well as International Carbon Trade and Domestic Climate Politics. Both of these articles were published in the journal Global Environmental Politics. And the presentation by Kathryn Harrison here today is titled Climate Activism, Climate Policy, and Fossil Fuel Exports.
It's really a pleasure to be part of this panel, and I look forward to learning from the other presenters and also from the question and answer discussion. This first slide is one that will be familiar to many people. It is the emissions of CO2 equivalent by different countries. You can see that the countries that account for the greatest share are China and the US. Deeper colors, more emissions. But as everyone who would attend a panel like this would know, it is more complicated by trade. We've talked a lot for more than 10 years about the difference between production emissions, the emissions that are released within each country's borders, and consumption emissions, because goods are being produced, typically in developing countries, high carbon production of goods, they are then being shipped, typically to wealthy countries. So the embodied carbon in those goods would be moving from country to country. And, even the previous IPCC report had graphs of both consumption emissions and production emissions where, the US, Canada, Canada's a bit more complicated. The US, Western Europe would have consumption emissions much higher than their production emissions. The opposite would be true of China. But I want to take a step back in the supply chain of fossil fuels and talk about where the fossil fuels came from in the first place. This is a figure from a 2014 publication by Davis, Peters, and Caldera, showing not all of the flows of unburned carbon in the form of fossil fuels, but the biggest. And you can see, of course, exports of gas from Russia, coal from Australia, the Gulf, OPEC Gulf states exporting oil all over the place, Norway's oil and gas exports to Western Europe, and Canada's oil and gas, primarily oil exports to the US. And what I want to talk about for the next 10 minutes or so is the implications of those trade patterns coming up against the norm in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement, that countries are responsible for reducing only the emissions that are released within their borders. The fact of those fossil fuels flying around the globe has the effect of decoupling that emissions responsibility from economic opportunities. So countries like Canada that export fossil fuels get to profit. They get the jobs, they get the GDP from producing those fuels, but the responsibility for the inevitably resulting emissions fall to destination countries. Historically, that has been the US, but Canada aspires to send more of our fossil fuels to other countries, and that creates some interesting politics. This is a screenshot of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau giving a speech before he was Prime Minister. I think this was in 2014 in Texas, where he argued that no country would find 173 billion barrels of oil in the ground and leave them there. His ability to say that was because, of course, Canada wasn't responsible for the combustion emissions of most of the oil, about 80% of the oil that we produce. And that has allowed the Trudeau government to commit, as they have done now in 3 elections and via various public policies, to climate action in the sense that they are committed to reducing Canada's own domestic production emissions, even as they have committed to continuing and at various times increasing Canada's fossil fuel exports. And they have had 3 main narratives to try reconcile continuing production of fossil fuels for export with climate action. The first is implicit in that quote from Prime Minister Trudeau that unilateral action would be futile in global markets. If Canada restricted our production of oil and gas primarily, some other country would just pick up that business and the emissions would be the same globally. A second argument that has become more important over time as it's become increasingly clear that we do need to leave those 173 billion barrels of oil in the ground, and so do other countries, is that we need the prosperity that the oil industry gives Canada in order to fund our transition to cleaner energy. And then finally, the third one, and this is specific to proposed exports of liquefied natural gas, was a phrase that was initiated by a former premier of British Columbia, that we would be doing the world a favor by exporting natural gas that in theory will substitute for dirtier fossil fuels and help reduce global emissions. Now, of course, each one of these narratives can be contested. There's also a challenge of unilateral action with respect to production emissions, but that doesn't stop countries from committing to reduce their emissions. And yet we don't talk about reducing our production. We need prosperity from oil to fund the transition away from oil is like, I need to eat more ice cream to build up my strength to go on a diet. And are we doing the world a favor with LNG? Really depends on what the pace and strategy for transition is in destination countries. Those narratives have worked pretty well for many years. I've been doing some comparative work with Guri Bang in Norway, and what's striking is how almost exactly the same the narratives that have been used by Norwegian political parties and governments are. But I'd argue they are now confronting 3 challenges. The first one is civil society activism against fossil fuel production. And starting, about 2010, we saw civil society, certainly in North America, but I think also in Germany, shift from only being attentive to things like calling for carbon pricing and regulation of emissions to moving upstream to arguments about keeping fossil fuels in the ground. Australian scholars Green and Dennis argued in 2018 that activism at the point of fossil fuel production can actually be more effective for a couple of reasons. One of them is that the opponent is more palpable. There's a particular project that is proposed. There's a single bad guy that can mobilize opponents. And that the inevitable costs of that restriction to the community at large are less visible than those which Australia certainly saw in a debate about carbon pricing and implications for electricity prices. I've argued in one of the papers that was mentioned in the introduction and the new paper with Guri Bang that that's not so clear cut. First of all, the economic benefits of fossil fuel production tend to be concentrated at the sites of extraction. Extraction tends to happen in remote communities that are dependent on these fossil fuel resources. So they don't take this opposition lying down. The challenge is particularly great in the case of countries that are exporters, both because they produce those fossil fuels on a large scale, so the economic benefits are much greater than would be the case to transition that country's own economy to cleaner sources of energy, but also that issue that they don't have to take responsibility for the reduction of the resulting combustion emissions. Those countries are only responsible for the emissions associated with extraction and getting the fossil fuels to the border. The one important potential exemption is transport infrastructure, which I've argued is more vulnerable than the actual sites of production because the rail lines, the gas and oil pipelines, the ocean terminals often cross jurisdictions that didn't produce the fossil fuels. So while the home jurisdiction is beholden to that industry, often quite dependent on that industry, especially in export countries for which the fossil fuel industry contributes significant GDP, other states or provinces don't care so much about the fossil fuel industry. And in fact, we have seen those in North America, activists have tended to focus on transport infrastructure. So we've got pictures here of the top left where the US was able to mobilize opposition to Keystone XL, I would say more easily because the oil isn't produced in the US. So this is a picture of protests at the White House. At the top right, we've got protesters marching against the Trans Mountain pipeline. The two at the bottom reflect that the opposition within Canada has had a special element where First Nations, especially First Nations in British Columbia that have not ever signed treaties to cede their traditional ancestral territory, have been some of the frontline opponents of these projects. The bottom left is opposition to the CGL pipeline to transport fracked natural gas to the coast of BC to export in the form of LNG. And then the one on the right is ongoing opposition from the Tiny House Warriors at the Sequapem territory in BC against the Trans Mountain pipeline. How has the opposition succeeded? And I would argue the record is mixed. The two pipelines failed, the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline and the Energy East pipeline. The final nail in the coffin was not hammered in by anti-pipeline activists, but I would argue in both cases, activists significantly contributed to the death of those projects. Activists, of which I was one, delayed a coal port. That isn't, again, what actually killed that coal port. It was the decline in the price of coal that took place in the intervening years of contestation. On the other hand, BC is still all in on development of an LNG sector, increasing our production of fracked natural gas. The federal government of Canada not only approved but bought a Trans Mountain expansion project, a major pipeline to the coast that is now under construction. And the interesting dynamic is that fossil fuel exports have supported adoption of carbon pricing. First in the province of Alberta, where one of the rationales for adopting a carbon price was to justify to the rest of Canada that Alberta's extraction-related emissions would continue to rise for at least 15 more years. And then in the next step, the federal government, in order to get Alberta's agreement to a higher carbon price, agreed to approve the Trans Mountain pipeline and subsequently bought it. So this weird dynamic, sort of a real-world version of the Trudeau narrative. But I think that's getting more difficult over time. for two reasons. I'm going to focus first on domestic climate policy and then the international side. This figure is the different sectors' emissions over time from 1990 to, I can't see the right side of the figure, 2018 probably. Two of these lines are not like the others. They are transportation emissions so those are combustion emissions within Canada. And then the line that is now at the top is emissions associated with extraction of oil and gas. So just the share of Canada's emissions that is associated with getting the stuff out of the ground is now the single largest component of Canada's emissions. And that means that it is no longer possible for Canada to meet its own emissions targets and give a free pass to the oil and gas industry. In December 2020, the federal government announced a new climate plan to meet our original Paris Agreement target of a 30% reduction in 2030. And to do that required $170 per ton carbon price. Now, at the current prices of $40, getting to $50 per ton next year, the oil industry's emissions will keep going up because the marginal abatement cost is probably $70 and $80 per ton. You start getting to $170 per ton, those extraction emissions will go down and increase the cost of Canada's oil significantly. And that was before our new NDC, which is to reduce emissions 40 to 45% by 2030. And that saw the re-elected Liberals in the recent federal election commit to establishing a cap on oil and gas industry extraction emissions and declining that over 5-year periods to net zero in 2050. Also a call for zero emission vehicle mandates, 100% of vehicles by 2035. Can carbon capture and sequestration save the Canadian oil industry? We hear a lot about that from Canadian oil producers, that they've committed to net zero by 2050. They're not so ambitious by 2030, perhaps not surprisingly. This is a study that compared upstream intensity of greenhouse gas intensity of crude oil production. So this is just the emissions to get the stuff out of the ground. Canada has the 4th highest emissions intensity, and the emissions intensity of the stuff we export is even higher because the production intensity includes conventional oil, whereas we disproportionately export bitumen from the tar sands, which are more emissions intensive. What that means is that if we were going to use extremely expensive carbon capture and sequestration to get our emissions down, it's going to cost a lot more than it will the oil industry in those other countries with less emissions intensive oil. The last challenge I'll talk about is increasing ambition, global ambition, and what that has the potential to do, of course, and that's the whole point, is to constrain consumption of fossil fuels globally. That will cause the price of oil and gas to fall, and markets will shrink, the price will fall, and Canada will be disproportionately hurt. And we know how important this is from the IPCC's 1.5 and AR6 reports. We know from a couple of different studies, McLeod and Eakins looking at a 2C world, one from this fall by Welsby et al. Looking at a 1.5C world, that we would see under those scenarios, Canada's oil exports disappear overnight. We are the first to go. But of course, the industry and supportive provinces and even the federal government have said, but we're not actually on track to 2C or 1.5C, and those markets still exist, so it's reasonable for us to compete. That's become more difficult with the IEA Net Zero report, which argued that under a 1.5C world, there should be no new investment in fossil fuel production anywhere in the world. Also more difficult after this summer's heat dome, when heat records were completely smashed across Western Canada. 560 people died alone in their homes in in my province from extreme heat, and the whole town of Lytton, where temperature records were shattered, burned to the ground on the final day of the heat dome. This report by the IEA, the World Energy Outlook 2021, came out just a few days ago, and this is really bad news for Canada's oil industry. They do different scenarios. The first is the current policy, stated policy scenarios. That's STEPS. That's the blue one. The announced pledges scenario includes net zero pledges, but also policies that are policy commitments that have been made. New NDCs under the Paris Agreement. That's where we would find Canada's commitment to a zero emission vehicle mandate. And what we see for oil is that there's still some growth under the stated policy scenario to about 2030, 2035. Then it levels off and declines slowly. But under the announced pledges, so this is what countries have said they're going to do, we see quite significant reduction. And of course, under the net zero scenario, which is consistent with 1.5C, oil consumption has to tank dramatically. Natural gas, the differences are more pronounced. Getting close to the end, I have a feeling I've gone over my time. This is a figure from well into the to page 200 of the WEO 2021 that compares what will happen to production between now and 2030 in various countries. The STEP scenario, again, is under current policies. That is a baseline, but not a plausible scenario because it's implausible that no countries will change their policies in the next decade. And Canada sees growth of 0.7 million barrels per day. But under the announced pledges scenario, Canada sees a decline in our production. And we're the only country there that sees that because our oil is relatively expensive to produce. It's relatively emissions intensive to produce. So Canada's own actions will increase the price of that. And it's also relatively greenhouse gas intensive to refine at destination. If they had included a net zero scenario, there would be very sharp lines to the left and Canada's production would disappear virtually overnight. So to summarize, historically, the intersection of international trade in fossil fuels and the International Accountability Convention under international climate agreements has undermined Canada's contribution to climate action. It has made it easy for Canada to pretend to be leaders on climate action while increasing our production of fossil fuel for export. And that increase in production has increased Canada's own emissions and meant we failed on every single target today. But the ground has shifted in three ways: the emergence and increasing impact, although still uphill battle of supply side activism, increasingly ambitious domestic targets that will have the effect of increasing the cost of Canada's already costly oil, and the prospect of increasing international ambition, which will threaten oil and gas markets everywhere, but Canada's will be the first to go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathryn. And that brings us to our second speaker, Tamara Kay. Tamara is Professor of Global Affairs and Sociology at the University of Notre Dame. Her research and teaching focus on the political and legal implications of regional economic integration, transnationalism, and global governance for labor and environmental movements, NGOs, and policy formation. Her books include NAFTA and the Politics of Labor Transnationalism, published in 2011 with Cambridge University Press, and Trade Battles, Activism and the Politicization of International Trade Policy, published in 2018 with Oxford University Press. Tamara, the floor is yours. Oh, sorry, I should say the title of Tamara's presentation is The Possibilities of Blue-Green Alliances and Trade Policy Transformation. So now the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone. It's really an honor to be here. Trade policy is very complex, so I don't pretend to know everything. We all collectively contribute to the knowledge, and so I am very grateful for the other speakers and for all of you in the Q&A for moving us forward in our knowledge and understanding of how all of this very complicated policy works. I'm going to contribute today the backstory to how we ended up with trade and labor rights embedded in free trade agreements. And so I'll do that because my main points are that the climate crisis, climate change, which I think we should call climate disaster. Change is a very neutral term for what's happening. Climate disaster requires massive international mobilization, I think. And in order to have that kind of massive international mobilization, you really need to think about activism, the activists who are engaged in this, and labor and environmental coalitions are necessary for those mobilizations. That's not to say that we shouldn't be working on kind of alternatives to activism, lobbying, policy, everything that's happening on the domestic level. That's all necessary too. I think we need to cover all bases. But without the mobilization, I think it's going to be very difficult. So we need domestic and international pressure. And to do this, solving the jobs issue, I think, is key. And also what Kathryn talked about in terms of, fossil fuel industry resistance and the impact of fossil fuel industries on, in particular countries in terms of their economies is critical to managing this, to dealing with it effectively. And so I want to start with the first free trade agreement that linked environmental and labor rights in the body of the agreement and in two side agreements. Now, this, of course, had been discussed in Europe, but this was an actual free trade agreement that really made this linkage for the first time. And so in making the argument that we need labor and environmental coalitions, I thought it'd be important to illuminate how we ended up with the first labor environmental coalition and how that coalition really transformed trade policy in North America. So I'll start with, and I'll focus today on the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, which no longer exists, which is another interesting story. But so that we appreciate the transformation that happened because activists were involved in this first enormous struggle over free trade in the early 1980s in North America. So prior to NAFTA, environmental concerns were not considered relevant to trade negotiations. And prior to the onset of the NAFTA debate, they were not included. And part of that was the belief that environmental interests do not map onto classical theoretical assessments of trade industry. So labor activists, labor unions, had an official role in the negotiations and on advisory trade committees in the United States, but environmentalists did not. And it's also understood that it's surprising that we ended up with this transformation of trade that prioritized labor environmental issues, because environmental organizations traditionally had less economic power. They didn't have constituents the way labor unions did. They were organized differently, and they weren't known for, with some exceptions, but in general, activism, at least in North America. So a lot of the North American environmental organizations were membership organizations, and they weren't actually engaged in a lot of activism. So environmentalists had no access to negotiators. Their issues were not on the table. And that's how, when the NAFTA negotiations began, that's what it looked like. So during the early stages of the NAFTA battle, what we saw happen was a coalition developed between labor activists and environmental organizations, labor unions and environmental organizations, in addition to indigenous organizations, women's rights organizations, farmers organizations, all kinds of organizations in civil society. But the two biggest and most consumer organizations, but the two biggest were really labor and environment. And labor had a seat at the table, but labor was really seen as an interest group and was seen as being involved in trade for self-interested reasons, whereas environmentalists were seen as concerned with the commons and a more universal understanding of how the environment affected all of us, not just a constituency. That's how they were viewed. And so early on, there was seen to be a benefit between the labor movement teaming up with the environmental organizations, because in piggybacking their issues, they could be beneficial to each other. So this greening trade discourse, and I actually looked at a lot of the congressional testimony that labor unions provided during the NAFTA negotiations. And what you saw happening was the labor unions started to talk about the environment, which was really not what they had traditionally focused on. They were still talking about jobs and wages, but they were also really focused on the environment and the environmental impact of NAFTA. So from the environmentalists, the labor activists gained this more universal greening discourse, blunting to some extent the self-interestedness of the labor movement. And the environmentalists gained a relationship with unions that had constituents, that had money, that already had relationships with legislators, and just a very strong presence that they had not had. So in transforming trade policy, this broad coalition was incredibly important. So what we saw happen during NAFTA was the coming together of these two big organizations, movements, and their ability to really transform trade policy. So what ended up happening with NAFTA was, although there wasn't a seat at the table for the environmentalists, eventually, with different kinds of pressure, they were able to gain official recognition for the legitimacy of their environmental claims. So the environment was discussed in NAFTA, even though the original USTR, US Trade Representative in the United States, said we're not going to have this on the table at all. And that changed rather quickly. They obtained a seat at the negotiating table. So even though they didn't have an official role in the advisory committees, eventually certain environmental organizations were allowed to participate. They turned a technocratic concern into a highly visible populist issue. So, people were talking about trade and the labor and environmental implications at the dinner table. Now, this was a policy issue that really had been a very wonky arena for economists. And now in the early 1990s, we saw it become part of popular discourse. It also spurred creation of a North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation, which had not been on the table in the beginning, which was the environmental side agreement. So we ended up with a labor side agreement and an environmental side agreement. And in the end, the labor side agreement ended up being weaker than the actual environmental side agreement. And so the North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation was stronger than the labor cooperation side agreement. It had a broader jurisdiction. It had a greater role for public participation, and it had stronger enforcement mechanisms. And I'm happy in the Q&A to go into why that was. There's a lot of details there that I don't want to get into now, but it ended up being stronger, and part of that had to do with the environmental organizations, the coalition splitting, and some pro-growth environmental organizations decided to support NAFTA, and the non-pro-growth environmental organizations and labor unions decided to fight NAFTA at the very end, and that split the coalition and created some problems for what they ended up with. Okay. So basically, this movement to impact NAFTA had really significant effects that really diffused around the world. When we look at what happened afterward, this coalition was created. It was replicated in different parts of the world, this labor environmental framing, to the point now that we take it for granted, the environmental impact of trade agreements. That wasn't the case before NAFTA. It was really not the case before NAFTA. So now this is, in subsequent trade agreements, this twinning of labor and environmental rights and protections is something we take for granted. And it created a well-defined and organized labor environmental coalition that was built domestically. So in the United States, domestic labor and environmental organizations organized in Canada. In Mexico, one of the interesting impacts of this struggle over NAFTA was that prior to NAFTA, Mexico, although they had a lot of environmental activism, there weren't a lot of formal environmental organizations, sort of civil society organizations. And what we saw after NAFTA was, because there was relationships built between the US, Canadian, and Mexican environmental movements, Mexican organizations started to be formed, modeled in some instances after US and Canadian organizations. So, and again, we see this throughout Europe in terms of labor and environmental organizations working together effectively to try to deal with trade. And let's see. And the outcomes were that these coalitions became more institutionalized in some cases. And so in the United States in 2006, the US Steelworkers and the Sierra Club and 12 large labor and environmental organizations formed the BlueGreen Alliance to basically focus on green jobs and environmentally and socially responsible free trade. The Canadian Labour Congress created Green Jobs Roundtable, which led to the creation of the Green Economy Network, over 24 organizations, also focused on green jobs and a green economy. And basically, this became an institutionalization of these two movements. Didn't include all the organizations in North America, of course, but it really institutionalized these movements and created a way to effectively deal with new trade agreements as they popped up. And so, at least in the United States, there was a battle after NAFTA, of course, over many trade agreements. And again, we saw in subsequent trade agreements the twinning of labor and environmental rights and protections. And these alliances would get reinvigorated and basically go to battle to fight trade agreements that were not considered strong enough in terms of labor and environmental protections. And so these coalitions fought in the United States against TTIP and against the TPP, and won in that case. And so, the argument here is that these kinds of broad coalitions are really necessary to trying to transform what's in trade agreements. Oh, 2 minutes, okay. We did in the United States recently have a renegotiation of NAFTA and ended up with the US Mexican-Canadian agreement, or NAFTA 2.0, where we actually did have a split in that coalition. That's a whole other interesting story, because ultimately unions pushed for a stronger agreement focused on the jobs and wages issue. The environmental organizations opposed the final agreement. We ended up with in this case, unlike the first time around, we ended up with stronger labor protections and very weak environmental protections. So the USMCA doesn't actually address climate change, which is a big problem. And I think the coalition was undermined by the jobs issue, although the BlueGreen Alliance continued and made no public comment on the different positions between organizations in the BlueGreen coalition. And so I think the upshot of all this is that if we are going to either solve or reverse climate disaster around the world, we need to focus on mobilization. We need to focus on insider and outsider activism strategies. So that means focusing on domestic policies. So what's happening around the world is, and at least in the United States, we have this movement for the green new economy. We have legislation, right, to from the progressive Democrats to focus on green jobs. And at the international level, it's still important for environmental and labor activists to continue to apply pressure on trade negotiations to demand a seat at the table and maintain that seat at the table, even if, in the case of NAFTA, the environmental and labor protections are not ideal and are weak. It's still important to have a seat at the table and continue to try to improve those agreements. And what's happening too, I don't know if people saw this, it was released on Monday, yesterday was Monday. And it is one of the partners who produced this is the International Trade Union Confederation. And it basically shows that money for green energy creates more jobs than fossil fuel investment. And basically they reviewed about a dozen studies from 2009 to 2020 to show, and you can Google this and look at it afterward too, to basically show that around the world, we would actually create green jobs that are better paying jobs if we focused on eliminating fossil fuels or mitigating fossil fuels and focusing on green investment. Okay. All right.
Thank you very much, Tamara. And then our final speaker is Gabriele Spilker from the University of Konstanz. Gabriele is professor of international politics, global inequality in the Department of Politics and Public Administration there in Konstanz. Her research examines the consequences of climate change for migration and conflict, as well as the inequalities in perceiving globalization processes. And recent articles of her include the pieces on the determinants of environmental migrants' conflict perception, published in International Organization, as well as what kinds of trade liberalization agreements do people in developing countries want, published in International Interactions. Her presentation here today is titled, How Important Are Environmental Concerns for Opposition to Trade Agreements?
Thanks, Achim, and thanks to both Kathryn and Tamara for their great presentations. They build a wonderful floor from which I can just take up and continue the story and slightly shift focus a level further down, really focusing on the individual level, what people perceive or how they perceive the linkage between trade and the environment. And I will come back to various issues raised by both Kathryn and Tamara, and I think all should fit very well, and I try my best to do so. So, as I said, I start where Tamara kind of left her presentation or stopped her presentation, namely with the newer protests we see against specific trade agreements. And if you want to, you can in some sense also see Brexit as having part of this trade components and kind of a backlash against here rules that came with the European Union, especially on trade and sovereignty and the like, something we will discuss later. And so what I'm concerned in part of my research is really what drives this backlash against trade agreements, and how important are environmental concerns in this context. To kind of put that in context, what I try to do first is put this in a larger framework on trade preferences and tell you a bit about how the literature perceives people thinking about trade and what kind of factors influence people's perception on trade first, and how the environment figures in this context. That's the first point I try to make, and I really want to make here the point that non-economic factors, especially the environment, have been found to be much more important or as important as economic factors such as potential income losses and the like. That's the first point I try to make. The second point I want to make is really that we often think about environmental issues, especially in its relation to trade. We often think this in the context of industrialized countries, but I also want to shift a bit the focus and move to the global south and tell you a bit about my research there and show you that environmental concern is nothing that is really confined to the industrialized world only, but also very important for individuals in the global south, as they also want their trade agreements to contain the very specific provisions Tamara just talked about. And then I show you in the final slides a bit about how still important it is for individuals that trade and environmental rules kind of go hand in hand, and how they want policymakers potentially to design rules that are still that protect both the environment but also are in line with WTO regulations. So one at a time. Before I come to the factors that influence people's perception on trade agreements, one factor that I want to highlight, what is very interesting, is that while we see this increasing backlash or lots of people protesting, especially against these big trade agreements, we also see in various surveys time and time again that a majority of individuals still find trade to be something good. And the question is a bit on how to align these two things. And what I want to argue, as I said before, is that it depends a lot on how these trade agreements are designed, and especially how they take care about the environment and connect to the environment, which matters a lot on how people perceive trade and trade agreements. As I said before, if I want to put this in a bigger framework on how people perceive trade agreements, what I call trade preferences over here, the literature typically sees three kinds of factors influencing them. One is the economic factors, here non-economic factors, and something I don't want to talk about today, or I would like to talk about, but due to time constraints won't talk about, potentially in the Q&A, is information or opinion formation and how policymakers can potentially influence this. Starting with the economic factors very, very briefly, for a long time, the literature thought that, oh, people just have these pocketbook concerns when it comes to trade, and they see trade as something good or bad, depending on how it affects them economically. And this, so the literature argued, depended a lot on the skill level of the people. So in industrialized countries, highly skilled people should prefer trade because it profits them, while lower skilled people shouldn't. That's exactly where Kathryn started off. People in the oil industry, working in the oil industry, often not so skilled people, might find it difficult later on to find a new job. And that brings me to the second factor, namely sector. Depending on how trade affects a specific industry, it might simply kill jobs, and therefore people should not like it or not. Other economic factors that was argued to be important were capital ownership and consumption, since, for instance, trade should make consumption more cheaper. It should therefore increase people's perception of trade. The literature has found kind of mixed evidence for all of these economic factors. On the one side, there is a bit of an discussion about what factors are really important. Is it what on the one side is here shown with the education aspect? Is it really the skills, or which is famously called the Heckscher-Ohlin model, or is it rather the sectors, which is called the Ricano-Weinhoff model? So both really relate to the redistributional effects of trade. And what we know from the empirical evidence is that, of course, it seems that both education and income, especially in industrialized countries, but also in developing countries, lead to more positive views on trade. What then has been asked, and this is something I relate later back, and as an interesting intersection with the environment, is this really an economic effect? Or have we, as educators at universities, for instance, told students time and time again that that globalization is something good and that they should like globalization? So have we socialized people? So that's something that might have happened, and so we don't really know, is it really this economic effect? What we have found, especially in the last years, that the sectoral employment, that this is something that really drives a large part of people's trade attitudes, especially the so-called China shock, which has been shown for both the US and the UK, that those regions that have been hit hard, where people really lost their jobs, that here attitudes towards globalization and trade agreements in particular went down. And here this connects nicely, I think, to what Kathryn has said before, namely that these effects are often very geographically concentrated. And there it depends a lot on the electoral system of a specific country, how specific actors can organize and how this political backlash against trade might kind of make its way through the political system. However, as I said before, the literature didn't stop there. It rather said, like, okay, that's the beginning, and it explains part of these trade agreement preferences, but not all. And then they moved on to so-called non-economic factors, such as socio-demographic factors, stuff like national identity, cosmopolitanism, and especially environmental concern. And what has been found here, just very briefly, is one effect that we often see or always see is this so-called gender gap, namely that women seem to be much more protectionist in the sense of they don't like trade as much as men do, something we can discuss later. But also that something like inequality aversion, nationalism affects trade. And something that came into the back door a little bit on this specific literature, although it has been there at least since NAFTA, as Tamara said, are these environmental concerns. And they are often called the green side of protectionism. And what drives these concerns? And these are really this idea that trade has these strong impacts on the environment. And often economists tend to kind of look at them from a scale, composition, and technology effect, and simply argue, okay, if we trade, that means more is produced. That is the so-called scale effect, and more is simply worse for the environment, typically, on average. Furthermore, we have this potential composition effect. That's something that Kathryn really talked nicely about, namely that the oil, okay, is maybe taken out of the earth in Canada, but then shipped somewhere else. And maybe the biggest part of the pollution happens somewhere else. And maybe we can be only so green as we potentially are because we shift our production via trade to other countries. One effect that doesn't get a lot of attention when individuals talk about this is the so-called technology effect, the trading up hypothesis, namely that trade potentially can also have positive effects, namely send or distribute technologies to other countries and thereby help them getting greener. So what we know from the literature and from various studies is that exactly these negative potential effects of trade on environmental protection, that they indeed lead a substantive amount of citizens to become more skeptical towards trade agreements than they would be if they were not that environmentally concerned. And on top of this, something comes with trade agreements in particular, namely, that is that people have this fear that these trade agreements might reduce the regulatory freedom of their countries. One example is the so-called chlorine chicken that was so famous with TTIP, that people in Europe are really afraid that they now have to eat all the chlorine chicken imported from the US. And an additional aspect of these trade agreements that comes in that we talked last week about is the so-called investor-state dispute settlement, namely that through the back door, so to say, there might be a regulatory chill that governments do not dare to regulate as harsh as they would or as strict as they should potentially, because they are afraid that investors might sue them for this. However, what this kind of ignores is, and this is what Kathryn, Tamara talked about, is that these preferential trade agreements often vary a lot in how they are designed. As we saw with NAFTA, since the late 1990s, most trade agreements have so-called environmental clauses and also labor clauses, of course, and they look very differently. So we have certain preferential trade agreements with strong environmental concerns and some with not so much. And what I did in my research was to see whether this really matters for individuals in how they evaluate trade and trade agreements in particular. So whether they are whether strong environmental concerns simply means they don't like trade, or whether it's possible to kind of design trade agreements with strong protection, environmental protection clauses in there that might kind of take away some of the concern citizens have. And making the thing very brief here, what we show time and time again is both for industrialized countries such as the US or for developing countries or countries from the global south, here's an example from Costa Rica, that first of all, they prefer partner countries with higher environmental standards. That's what is shown here. And this is an example from a survey we did in Vietnam, that even countries that are really not at the industrialized stage as Canada or Europe, that they also really prefer trade agreements that contain strict environmental standards, even if this might, if you control for economic costs. What that means is that even individuals in the global south really prefer have these strong environmental concerns and prefer these trade agreements that come with them. And finally, just out of the box from my research today, what we've shown in a survey from Switzerland is that even if people like the environmental clauses to be in the preferential trade agreements, they really want them to be designed in a WTO like fashion. So they don't want them to break WTO rules, but they really want them aligned. I can talk more about this here later. So they want a measure that is in alliance with WTOs, and not because it might affect retaliation, but really because of the international law. So here I stop. The various points I would like to make is, first, we have a lot of factors that influence public opinion on trade. Economic factors are important, but often non-economic factors, especially the environment, seem more important. And here it is important, exactly what Tamara said before, how to design these preferential trade agreements, because they can really increase public support, or the public support can be decreased. Finally, these factors intersect in very interesting ways. Highly educated people, for instance, like us, are typically more pro-trade, but they are also more pro-environment. And so one can kind of work against the other. And finally, another point that is really important for me is that we kind of open our worldview a bit and also look at the countries in the global south, because here also environmental concern plays a huge role. And information.
So finally, we have our discussant, Gabriele Siles-Brügge from the University of Warwick in the United Kingdom. Gabriel is reader in public policy in the Department of Politics and International Studies at Warwick, and his research interests include the politics of trade and investment regulations, the role of economic ideas in policymaking, as well as the political economy of Brexit. His recent publications include articles in leading journals, as well as a co-authored book that some of you might have seen titled TTIP, The Truth About the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. So Gabriel, the floor is yours.
First of all, let me say thank you very much for having me here. It's been a pleasure to work with Joan, with Gabi and Achim as part of the Jean Monnet Network on Transatlantic Trade Policy. It's really great, and hopefully in the future we can have some in-person events as well as part of that. Thanks also for plugging the book, although it feels a lot less recent, having been published over 5 years ago. But what's interesting in a sense here, I think, is that listening to these presentations, I was struck by the fact that actually activism on environmental issues is, there's a long history to it, and there are echoes of issues in the TTIP campaign that I think were already present back when NAFTA was being negotiated. And I think taking a long sort of a longue durée view of these things is quite interesting. So I found all the presentations in this respect quite useful. And of course, I think the environment during TTIP, and in general in the context of transatlantic trade politics, has been a lot of, a lightning rod for a lot of the activism, right? So a lot of the opposition to, for example, ISDS was around or prompted by investor to state dispute settlement mechanism, right? Where foreign investors can take states to independent arbitration panels. A lot of those were centered on issues around energy and issues of relevance to climate change. In the German case, Vattenfall, over both the phase out of a coal power plant, I think it was in Hamburg, and the more general federal level phase out of nuclear power, right? So these issues are really important. And so, it prompted me, listening to the presentations, I had a couple of general comments and then some more specific ones for each of the presenters. And I'm going to try and be as brief as possible to give as much time as possible to the floor, to our attendees to ask their own questions. But the first question was prompted, that I wanted to ask all the panelists, was prompted by a piece I read today, or no, not today, this week, I should say, in the Financial Times. So obviously take it with a pinch of salt, given the editorial line. But I guess my question is, to what extent can trade agreements satisfy activist demands for action on environmental issues such as climate change, or are they barking up the wrong tree? Is the trade regime the place to pursue ambitious environmental / climate change policy? And I'll come back to that when I ask my questions to Kathryn, because her presentation, I think, brings out that arguably what's happening isn't about the trade regime, it's about other things. It's about trade, but not the trade regime. And then the second question, which is prompted, I think, by this sort of desire to see things in longer perspective. And in this sense, it was really helpful to have both Gabi's and Tamara's presentations, is linked to, or is about the extent to which there's been evolution in activism on environmental issues in the trade sphere, both in terms of the framing. So, the issue of ISDS, for example, has been linked to the environment in the past, but of course, the issue of climate change, I think, has grown in importance. So has there been a shift in the way these things are framed? And secondly, also in terms of, specific tactics, in terms of the coalition sought, but also kinds of mechanisms, right? One of the things I've looked at is, the use of, petitions at the municipal level to sort of, garner interest. And that's something that's happened across time. But of course, the current conjecture makes it more difficult to sort of have face-to-face interaction. So I was wondering whether you could all three comment maybe a little bit on different tactics for activism. And then I'll try and stick to one point for each of the presenters. So starting with Kathryn, really interesting presentation. And if I was going to be provocative, I would sort of sum it up as, in the context of today's panel, as saying, well, actually, what matters is not so much what's being done in the trade regime. What matters is, other factors. And so my provocative question to you would be, is that A, am I misrepresenting your argument? But also B, is there something that you can do through the trade regime? I'm thinking here particularly, for example, of an initiative which, let's see if it has any legs, that's being pursued, I think, predominantly by New Zealand around, introducing disciplines on fossil fuel subsidies, both production and consumption subsidies. So is that something that is useful or not so useful? For Tamara, really, really interesting presentation. I guess if you could say a little bit more about the, sort of drill into the detail on USMCA. Why is it weaker on the environment? You alluded, I think, to the absence of, references to climate change, which I suppose, given the Trump administration, is not unsurprising. But could you say a little bit more? Because, of course, looking at it from the outside, the environment was brought into the agreement when it was a side agreement before. ISDS no longer covers disputes between between investors in Canada and the United States, investing reciprocally. And I think the scope is also limited in the Mexican case. So yeah, if you could just sort of tell us why. I mean, it's not a doubt. I just wanted you to spell it out a bit more explicitly, perhaps. And then finally, for Gabriele, a really interesting presentation. I mean, at the moment, actually, there was some echoes of what you were saying, because I'm reading Sean Ehrlich's book on fair trade. And so his argument is, in effect, that we shouldn't talk about free trade versus protectionism, but we should talk about people who, trade policy preferences that are also shaped about a concern about for environmental and labor protection in third countries. I mean, there are issues there, I guess. I suppose you could say that that's another sort of binary there. Yeah, I was wondering what your view was, in terms of trade policy preferences and the role that the environment plays in those. Because arguably, you could also have a sort of preference for domestic environmental policies, but in the sort of Ehrlich sort of presentation, then that would be classed as protectionist, right? Potentially. So yeah, I was wondering if I could push you a bit on that. But yeah, no, really interesting presentations. I hope I haven't spoken for too long.
No, thank you very much. We do not have a lot of time, but we do have about 15 minutes for discussion. So I will not go right back to the presenters, but give you the floor again at the very end for brief comments. And now want to invite questions from the audience.